Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about image composition in preparation for our final and when you guys are composing your final images. This will kind of go over mostly an art history and art theory kind of context, but there are some examples at the end that are a little bit more practical, but these are supposed to help you guys design better looking images at the end. Okay, so if I was giving this lecture live, what I'd ask you guys about is if this is a good composition. And the answer is yes. So the reason why is that this, despite being a very messy and disorganized looking image with a lot of very wild and uncontrollable marks, the overall structure and design of the image is very easy to understand. And it's essentially structuring the information in this image in a way that's cohesive and easy for us to understand, right? So you have like a lot less busyness behind this book, right? All the busyness is kind of like towards the edges or in these areas you don't want to look. The skin and the book are very clearly rendered. There's a lot of high contrast here with this really bright white background against this red right here, so it stands out. When you squint at it, you can kind of really see it, and then everything else kind of falls flat. So it is very well structured in terms of how it is pulling our eye to what the artist wants us to look at. And here's an example of a composition of its look before and then after. And so the main design decisions that have been made have been essentially to make all of the different elements and pieces of the image start working together, right? So you have all this interesting stuff going on, and there's a basic composition here, and it's pretty good. I mean, this is a professional artist, so even at the beginning it was very good. But it's pretty good even before he makes all the changes. But you have all these different characters off to the side, you have some sky combat, and you have these two central figures. And these two central figures, what's already working is that background is kind of clear around them, right? So you can really read these characters well. These guys are all kind of like mixed together and they become like one big mush or unit. And then in this one, the modifications he's made is he's having all these other elements in the image support it, right? They're all kind of leading your eye. You have all these lines kind of pointing towards the center, even the character's arm. Well, he was already doing that, but you can see that we're also using this character's sword kind of pulling in a little bit of the action of the horse. And so he rearranged this composition to have everything in the image start to push you into the focal point. So composition. The rules of composition are essentially rules that we're setting up for making sense of images and making appealing and eye-catching images. There's rules to what makes a good composition, but these are meant to be broken, right? So they're not things that you have to stick to, but it gives us a structure to be creative. They can reliably guide the eye to where you want the viewer to look, and it can help us communicate ideas about what we want the viewer to look at. So while these are all kind of rules on ways to make your composition better, that doesn't mean you have to abide by them to make a good composition. They just give you a good groundwork, especially if you don't really know what you're doing. So lines are one of those foundational elements of building compositions. And so our eyes are sensitive to subtle variations across an image. So the lines that separate forms, so we'll notice our eyes are drawn to variations that are very distinct and immediate. So like the edge of a line right here, right? So this is a very subtle change or sudden change. And then there's also more subtle changes. And so while our eyes are sensitive and we can see a lot of this information, it's leading our eyes around and drawing our attention, right? We can take advantage of that and use stronger differences and stronger variations and surfaces to pull our eye. And so these can be used to create lines, right? So you can see here we have this distinct border or this transition of value in an uninterrupted line, and that becomes essentially creates a line. It creates a shape. So lines separate forms and complete shapes, right? They're what gives us like the sense of an object with just two-dimensional marks. So we have three different types of lines. We have actual lines, we have implied lines, and we have psychic lines. So moving on, talking about lines and edges. So an edge's sharpness is determined by the texture and value contrast between its boundaries, right? So losing an edge while finding another can be used strategically to control where the eye is constrained. So, you can have an area right here, right, where this boundary or this edge has a very low contrast. So the value contrast up here is really low. And so this kind of has like a softer edge and it starts to fade out, right? And then you have this really sharp contrast or this very sharp value and not a lot of texture here, and that gives you a really hard edge, right? So this is the idea about like found edges and lost edges. So anything that's when you say something is found, that means it's drawing your attention, and when you're saying something is lost, it means you're purposely letting the object or that kind of area fall back into obscurity. In this case, it makes the lines or the edges more distinct or less distinct. So here's an example, right, from Rembrandt. And so this is a really great example of lost and found edges. And so you can see over here, I've highlighted the found edges and highlighted the lost edges. So, areas where, there's not as distinct of a valued jump, it creates a much subtler line and shape. And then areas where you have this really, really strong contrast or this really, really sharp and sudden line transition, you have this found effect, which really pulls our eye to this area right here where we're getting most of these found edges. So we have actual lines. So actual lines are usually sharp value edges that block in a shape. A long straight object like a prop can also act as a little arrow pointing towards the focal point. So actual lines can be like these, right? They're literally lines drawn on the image. Actual lines can be like the silhouette of an object, right? So the a line of this character's arm against the background, right, is creating a line. These objects are also acting as a line, right? Like these pliers kind of pushing in, and even maybe this number could be considered an actual line as well. So these are what we think of as obvious lines. These are lines we can see in the image. So here's an example, right? Actual lines would be all of the obvious ones that we see that delineate an object and mark a boundary between objects or surfaces. Even some shading stuff, right? You can see like the line of this shadow transition right here and here, right? So those are actual lines. And then we also have objects that are, literally acting as lines. Then we have implied and psychic lines. An implied line is a connection between two separate points that aren't literally connected by a value line. So this can be gestures, this can be hidden forms like the spine, this can be something that's kind of oriented or pushing in a particular direction, and then it creates an implied line that does have an effect on the composition. This is also, we have broken multiple objects that can be working together to create one line. Psychic line is something that isn't visible but is felt as a mental connection. So a most common psychic line that we're going to see is the direction of the eyes. So you'll see these characters' eyes are oriented a certain way, like the orientation or an object kind of facing a particular direction. If you think of it having a face, that's going to be a psychic line. It's going to push um, essentially like gravity towards that direction that they're facing. So here's some examples of implied and psychic lines. So green is psychic, red is implied lines. So you have some implied lines, right? So you have her arms are kind of completing a gesture, right? This cloth and this fabric right here there's an actual line here, but it's also kind of like the movement of the cloth and these two cloths, right, working right here. Even though these lines are a little bit more complex in here, they're kind of working together as like an implied line up this way. And you can even see just like the orientation of his arm and legs are also acting as lines that are drawing us in. You can even see these characters' hands pointing. His hand is placed strategically here and here, going towards his face, right? Even these two characters' heads are aligning in a way that would, if you drew a line through them. So this may seem like we're just picking out lines in the image that's like convenient for this example, but this is all strategically designed, right? This is what's making something feel um, like cohesive, feel like a designed image. It makes it feel really satisfying to look at, amongst other things. And of course, we have our psychic lines, right? These are the lines that are, because of the direction these characters are pointing, we want to look there, right? If you see someone, you're watching someone's face and then they all of a sudden look in a particular direction, you're going to feel that urge to look in the same direction they're looking at. So the human gaze has a lot of weights to it. So here's an example of a great psychic line, right? So even though we can't see the character's face or head, we know the direction they're looking at, and so we feel this connection here. So you can use these lines to place them throughout your composition, to move the eye through the composition toward the focal point. So you can use it like a map, right? Like you'll have multiple focal points, you'll have multiple parts of image you might want the viewer to look at, and so these lines can like lead you or lead the viewer through the image in the way you want them to. So literal lines combined with subtle implied lines, can give you, that kind of ability to control or map or direct traffic through your image. So here's a really great example, right? We have a lot of literal lines, right? So we have like the body shape, right? These are literal or implied lines, depending on how you define them, right? This is just like the flow of all these different supporting elements, all these different implied and literal lines, like kind of pushing us up into this center area right here, and making this, yeah, this really strong connecting supporting element from this character here and this character here, right? And then that connection of their arms, those background characters, and that rope, all drawing you to that face. So all very, very meticulously designed and crafted. Um, an easy way of structuring this composition around using lines is just the spoke wheel effect. So this is where you just have a focal point, kind of like this one back here, where you have the lines essentially drawing you to a very specific focal point. So these are going to be lines that are just all leading together there. So in the top example, we have a bunch of natural lines that lead to the eye. So, you know, the continuation of this cart to his back, pushing this way. We also have like structure of the cart, this really big, forceful line. And of course, you have the character's horns pushing you towards the eye. Like that's where we want to look. This portrait, right? Like this telescope, this the window framing, this tapestry back here, even this um, steering wheel. That's probably not what it's called. Is all pointing towards his face, even his arms and body, right? So it's all kind of pointing up towards the face. So besides line, value is probably the most important part to work with in terms of controlling where the viewer is going to look. So a quick change in value in an area is going to be contrast, right? Increased contrast. So if you have a sudden change between value, a really abrupt change in value, you're going to have contrast. So sharp contours rely on high contrast and value and separate shapes. So you can see like the sharp separation here, just like that Rembrandt example, that painting where I was showing lost and found edges. This one over here, those are both really high contrast. And then you have areas in here where these lines are like much subtler and very low contrast, and those are going to be lost edges, right? So high contrast is also going to bring an element forward in the image. It's going to push its attention forward. So in this example, right, you know, areas of high contrast are going to be, you know, this side of the face, right? We have all this different high contrast, lots of value range, and we also have this like very clear silhouette isolated in the background. And you know, there's other elements going on in here like isolation, right? We have a unique object back here amongst a lot of architectural elements, so that draws our attention. And then of course, the human eyes are almost always going to be the strongest, you know, interest driver, focus driver. But you know, value is the main structure here. This is what's helping us understand the space and helping control where we're looking at. So value fields can be used to separate and organize space. So layering value fields gives the illusion of depth, and it can be used to frame a subject much like lines can. So, you know, in this case, value can be used to give a sense of middle ground, background, and foreground, right? So in this case, we have like a grouping of value here that is giving us this like foreground element, and we have a grouping value of here, which is all giving this background element, and then the characters in the middle, right? In this case, it's giving us like a framing of the subject in here as well. So regions of restricted value can help structure and order the space, much like this one, right? So an example you can give is having like a foreground, middle ground, background, or different depths area levels. They'll have like the same kind of general value region, and so that helps you separate the objects. So in this case, like the background's all going to be really, really dark. The midground is going to be like a darker value, and then the foreground is going to be white. But then you can have any mixture of that. But what helps with that is it kind of helps give us the illusion of depth, right? You can see all three of these. You can get a clear sense of what's behind, middle, and forward. And also, we can use grouping to help understand the subject, right? So this is very common in things like um, character design, right? Where you're going to have very clear areas where all the objects or all the elements start to kind of like integrate together and they feel like they work as one unit. And then you have like high interest areas where something's really special that stands out. Um, so yeah, so here's one of my favorite examples to give in this, was Gustave Doré. So you can see in these images that he's very clearly using restricted value regions to really establish separation of space and separate the characters, right? So you have these lost souls that are, I guess, going to purgatory or something like that. And so here, right, where our attention is drawn in this area, so they're brightest over here, but then as they go into the background, they start to blend in with the background, right? So kind of that concept of low value contrast, right? Like there's a very low value difference back here, but up here there's a high value difference, so it draws our attention. Um, these two characters, while they're not the most high contrast elements, right? Your eye is drawn here first, they're probably the second most, right? And so they're really important. We want to pay attention to them. So you can see that they're kind of separated from these guys. And then you can see there's like this really designed cave shadow, right? So there's almost like a little cave entrance right here that's right behind them. Because if they were the same value as this rock right here, like there wasn't this hole, then they'd get, a little bit lost or they wouldn't stand out as much. So you can see he's very literally like kind of silhouetting these characters against the background. So that all has the effect of drawing our attention here, right? Um, Another example of this would be another term you'll hear is light over dark and dark over light. So, using value contrast of layering restricted regions of value to make something that stand out or draw your attention. So in this case, we have these two characters, and while this scene has a lot of complexity to it, right? You have a lot of complex elements in the background, you have a lot of complex texture. These two characters successfully stand out. And the reason is if you kind of drop this down to just value, you'll notice that, while this background is really complex back here, the relative value range, the differences between all these objects, the values, is pretty low. But then you put Stoic's skin next to that, and his skin is much brighter than all of this. So it really stands out, even though his clothes kind of are in the same value range. And then the mother back here, right, while there's a lot of texture and a lot of color back here, it's all within the same value range again, right? It's very low value range. And then she's a really sudden and dark shape against that background. So she stands out a lot. So this is very simple structuring, right? One thing that kind of helps, in my opinion, is squinting your eyes. And you can kind of see how they stand out, right? As you squint your eyes, things that have a low value contrast or low value range start to kind of blend together, and things that are high value difference pop out. So there's some examples, right? All we have to do is just take the image, and while we have a lot of color, a lot of complexity in the scene, right, you drop it to black and white, and you can see how his head against that background just pops, right? Draws your attention very clearly. So shape, we want to organize our image to make like that's what we want to do when we see an image, and that's how we interpret the world. We want to simplify and organize it in our brain. So our brain tries to simplify complex shapes into simpler ones. And so we can use this idea of limiting value and kind of creating these different value structures to take advantage of this. So we can separate our spaces into positive and negative, where positive is that area that is like the found area, that's the high contrast and interesting area, that's the area with the most activity to it. And the negative space draws least attention to. That's where, your eyes get lost. You don't really want to look there. Your eyes kind of skip over there to go to the positive areas. So the active and static shapes of an image merge to form areas of positive or negative. So in this case, right, with this is from John Singer Sargent, painting of Teddy Roosevelt. His coat and his background, they act, they do have different shapes, right? They're distinct from each other, different spaces. But for the most part, this is pretty empty space, right? This is a pretty passive space. This is a space you don't want to look at because the value contrast, even right here, is so low. But then you look at his hands, and you look at his face, and then all of a sudden you have all this value punching through, right? It's like lights and darks next to each other that are really giving a strong impression. And so we pay a lot of attention there. And even his shoulder, right, popping against the background versus this other arm in his coat popping against this background, right? This pops out way more because that value contrast is higher. Let's skip through this. Okay, so framing. Window is created by objects that enclose the subject. So you can essentially frame something by wrapping or kind of uh, blocking off parts of the image through the shape of an object. So you can use this to emphasize the subject that's within the window, and that's going to draw your attention. So this can be like literal frames, like in this case, it's like a door frame, but it could also be design elements that naturally close off a space. So it could be something like a tree or something like a fabric or a cloth that's kind of drawing, blocking off an area or part of the image, kind of like a barrier, and keeping your focus in a particular area. Here's a good example of framing, right? So in this case, all of these characters in the back are acting as like a frame, right? You see all this empty space around them. And of course, they have like the literal halos behind them that are acting as a framing. And you could even say her hood is also acting as a frame around her head. But you can see we're like kind of using different parts or shapes, combined areas of our image to block off and contain the subject, the thing you want to look at. And here's another example, right? So in this case, very intentionally designing the trees and also designing the groupings of these characters and giving this kind of like isolation around this character to really frame them and make them something you want to focus on. Here we're creating a frame of this like light shape, right? So this is like an implied line, right, of all these the light pattern on these books and paper that are kind of working together. And you can see this is acting as like a container, right? A framing for this character right here. Same thing with the light here. And then all of this stuff is all areas or information you don't want to look at, right? That's the area we want to keep the viewer from, staring at. And naturally we don't. We don't want to look at them because they're not interesting. There's not a whole lot of value contrast. So in this same kind of concept or area, you can call this term of combining objects together with value as shape welding or effect. This is large overall shape patterns. So James Gurney, who I referenced earlier, used the term shape welding. This is where you're having a bunch of complex objects work together as a simpler shape because they're the same value. So in this case, with this picture of these girls, right, their skin and their shirts all kind of work together, right? All the complexity of the trees in the background work together. Their dresses work together, right? And then their faces are so distinct, and there's a lot of value contrast where they kind of separate, right? They start to be unique and interesting. So this is kind of the summary of everything we talked about so far is, we're organizing our image and we can use the advantage of value, contrast, and lines to create shapes, to block off complex areas, make them simpler, and draw our attention to the characters. So here's an example of, shape welding where we have, this whole character right here is simplified into one shape, right? Because there's a lot of the same value uh, combining together, working together to create like a triangular shape. Same thing with this character. Same thing with this guy right here, right? Is all working together as one larger shape, maybe two larger shapes if you squint at it. And this character is clearly isolated and separated. So really well organized despite being a very detailed image. This is very organized and easy to understand. So on that note, we have this concept of Gestalt. So Gestalt is this theory that our brain, again, is organizing an image into simpler pieces. And this is where you would say like the sum is greater than the parts, or how you see the forest instead of the individual trees. So we group similar objects that are near each other or work together to create a larger shape. So this is a good example here that despite this just being a bunch of random blobs, they work together to create a larger form that we can understand, and that's all done by grouping and aligning the shapes, right? So we can think about this in terms of proximity, right? So we group these different, even though these are all the same shape, right? We tend to think of them as, larger shapes, right? We see a larger square up here, and then we see three like little rectangles down here, and that's literally just changing the spacing. So you can organize the structure image just by clustering assets together. So you can see these flowers are grouped together, these oranges are grouped together, but then this orange stands out because he's separated from these other ones, and so that draws a lot of attention to him. He has a lot of visual weight because he's different, right? Whereas these all merge together. So here's an example, right? You can just, if you put two things next to each other and they overlap or they cluster together, they tend to start to work together. But then separate them, then they feel like distinct elements, right? Here you can see this still life right here, very, very intentionally like overlapping and clustering these into smaller groups. And that triangular composition is really nice. But just by like overlapping them or kind of grouping them together, you have these distinct areas of found busyness and rest, right? We kind of like have these islands that helps us structure an image. Here's another example, right? Evenly spaced. This is one I set up in Maya. So we have these three bottles, three lemons, and you can see just by like grouping them, of course, I'm doing more interesting things like, you know, rotating them and stuff like that. But just by overlapping them and grouping them and putting them together, it creates a little bit more interesting image, and then they kind of work as larger shapes, right? I don't think of these distinctly as three bottles, one, two, three. I think of this as a group of bottles. This is a group of lemons, and then there's a separate lemon, right? Just by changing their spacing. We have similarity, right? So that's something being unique or distinctive. So in this case, all these apples, while they're overwhelmingly the most, proliferated, largest, biggest piece of this image, they're also probably not that interesting or it doesn't draw your eye because they're also similar to each other. So they all kind of work together as one big object. And then this object is so distinct from everything else that it is, doesn't catch our attention. We talked about continuity of lines, gestured and implied lines, and so working with those to draw our attention and create more larger shapes. This is a term of law of good figure, which is, again, kind of coming to that idea of shapes working together with whether they're overlapping or it's using value or there's implied lines. And so in this case, there's certain compositional structures that are really pleasing and work really well. One of those is a triangle, right? A triangle, pyramidal kind of shape, and it can be like an isosceles triangle, it doesn't have to be equilateral. Um, Tends to be a really satisfying um, compositional structure. It's probably one of the safest you can work with. And so in this case, law of good figure is you're worrying about the larger structure of your composition, right? So even though you have these distinct elements here, you're looking at the whole. You're thinking about how that all works together on a larger scale, and if that is an attractive or good composition. So here's an example, right? Lots of complex elements, but generally kind of supporting this triangular structure of this kind of like, sloping up towards and squeezing in a little bit, right? Here's another example, right? Kind of drawing our eye from his foot up to his head and then his arm kind of completing that triangular structure. Here's another example, right? Much pretty explicit, I think, but having this wave and the light value kind of creating the structure here, and then you of course have this rigging that's also creating this triangular structure. Tangents is something you need to consider when you think about lines. So this is where linear elements almost touch, or they do touch in a very awkward way. So this creates a lot of visual tension in the image. So this is eye-catching and disruptive. And tangents can also break the illusion of space and depth, right? So that can make things not feel understandable. So tangents can sometimes be used for good, but a lot of times they just make the image a little bit harder to read, or they're really distracting, right? You want to keep looking at them. So here's an example, right? This in this arrangement of this composition here, you have all these tangents where things just barely touch or overlap, right? They're just barely like almost meeting each other. And so usually the suggestion for that is either separate them more or go ahead and overlap them, right? So in this case over here, almost all of these are just giving a little bit more space just to kind of relax those a little bit. And so here you have an example, like both of these glasses could have been placed so they're just like right next to it, but this one has just enough space, and this one they just overlapped it, right? So that really helps with that image. So here's an example, and I call it like kissing. Like the objects are almost kissing each other, so it's like a little awkward. So you can see here they're barely touching each other, and so to kind of solve that and make it look less awkward, I can either just give them a little bit more space or just go ahead and overlap them. So um, speaking of organizing our image and making it make sense, you if there's extremes to this, right? So obviously, if you have too chaotic of an image, it's really hard to look at and it's exhausting, right? Like that top example. And then if your image is very repetitive or static, right, or it's too similar, then it can be really boring. So finding a balance with unity is important for creating a compelling composition. So finding a right amount of chaos and order to keep your composition fresh and interesting. Um, Emphasis is one of the easiest ways to add weight to a composition. So and balancing it out. So the greatest method of creating a focal point and emphasizing an area is through contrast. So by making contrast, we talked about is a value difference, but contrast can be a difference of anything. Contrast could be a difference of color, like we see here, but it could also be a contrast of size. It could be a contrast of shape language, right? Is it round or is it sharp? So when something is distinctly different, then it draws our attention. So here's some emphasis approaches using that idea of contrast. So we can draw attention in several ways. So value contrast is the obvious one, but we can also pull attention with lines and tangents and how we group them. So again, I call this is value contrast, but I would call a lot of these things, well, there's tangents. We talked about tangents, but this is a contrast of proximity, right? So in this case, we're isolating this asset over here, which is creating a distinct contrast compared to up here. Here we have everything's more or less the same, but then we have this really distinct value contrast. So it's very different. Anything that's different is going to draw our attention. So here we have, this proximity isolation, right? You have a lot of these cleared out seats right in front of him. These guys are all overlapping, so they're working together in a larger shape. He's also pretty, when you squint, he's pretty high contrast compared to these guys, right? So there's not a lot of value difference on their face against their background, whereas he's very distinct. Okay. So just like we discussed using actual implied lines, we can also use lines to point at the focal line, right? So, using lines and shapes in the composition when we talked about James Gurney's spoke wheel effect, that can lead your eye towards the focal point. And we can generally just draw attention to something simply by having it be different from its environment. So we talked about that, like contrast is just different. So here, just being a different shape from the environment draws your attention to it. Colors that are vibrant or highly saturated also jump forward and catch our eye. Colors that are neutral, that are closer to gray, recede. We can also use the difference in hue to create contrast. So, like if it's the difference between blue and red, or in this case, we have this really bright, saturated, unusual color, and all these guys have the same color, right? Because he's different, this little blue in here really has really strong compositional focused attention, right? It has like a lot of weight. So here's another example of isolation, right? Isolating the character. In this case, everybody else has these really, really bright red feathers, but he doesn't, right? So all these red feathers start to become like kind of like lost area, and he becomes like a focal point through other things as well, right? Again, here's another example of isolation, right? All of these characters who are sitting on the ground are all, kind of blending together because they're all kind of so similar to each other. And then these three characters are so different from them because they're uniquely silhouetted and they stand out. And of course, they have high contrast against their background. So elements in a composition can carry weight. Weight is determined by probably pretty much any property of it, right? What its value is, color saturation, where it's placed, how big it is. So then balancing these weight properties on an image can make an image feel well balanced despite it being very asymmetrical. So in this case, we have two squares, and this is supposed to be implied to be well balanced image, right? So on the right hand side is supposed to be the same weight as the left hand side. And so the reason why is even though this square is bigger, so size has a greater weight, over here this has a very distinct value contrast against background. It's way higher contrast than the square over there. So it has like a lot of density to it. And so that balances it out across the middle of the image. So we can imagine a line drawn on the image. So using weight on either side's imaginary middle can tip the image one way or another, kind of like a seesaw. And a symmetrical image doesn't always mean it's mirrored across the middle, but that it's evenly balanced. So in this case, over here we have a much larger object, and then we have this object over here. Because this one's so close to center, again, you can think of it like a seesaw. Even though it's much heavier, but it's so close to center, this one's all the way over towards the edge because it's trying to counterbalance it. Here's, you know, this one's actually pretty evenly balanced, a lot of same value contrast on both sides, just very different value regions, right? In this case, we have these two groupings of characters, right? You have this tree that's isolated against the background, and then you have these two elephants that are drawing a lot of attention to that side. And if you were drawing like an image or a line through the middle, right, they kind of counterbalance each other on the image on opposite sides, right? Same thing here, right? We have these really strong, prominent chili peppers in the foreground, right? This big bush right here. And then we have this woman in the background on the other side of the image. She's much smaller, but she's kind of counteracting it, right? And here, this is another example where, you have this really, really distinct, these like funky shoes. They're really red and they pop and they're really balancing out against this a lot, right? So this is a pretty busy part over here, right? But then this is so cool and neutral that those shoes just like really stand out against that background, and so they work together. And here's another example, right? A really large object, closer to the middle, the other character smaller, but kind of closer to the edge of the image. Another, really basic tip that you can work with is breaking your image into the rule of thirds. So it's creating a grid of 9 squares, and where these lines, these edges of the squares lie, are usually really strong focal areas. It's just like a nice area to put your focal elements to keep it balanced. So the reason why is if you put everything in the middle, kind of gets flat. It's not very dynamic. But then if you put things towards the edge, right, at the edge of the frame, it tends to be really unbalanced and feel uncomfortable, right? Like you're like, oh, that thing's about to fall off the image. So somewhere between the center and the edges is this kind of like midway spot. So that's generally where it's a really good spot to put stuff, right? So you can see a lot of these compositions, if you overlay the rule of thirds, that grid lines up with a lot of the focal elements and where they're showing up at. Very common in movies, very common in placement and composition for frames in film. So here's an example I'm going to walk through. This was an example I found online, but it had a lot of great steps to it. So here we have a pretty static composition, right? It's more or less centered in the middle. It's one big object because, all the oranges in that bowl all work together. So it's not terribly interesting because, everything's kind of grouped as one element. So one of the first things we can do is we can take advantage of proximity, right? So we're taking one of those oranges and we're separating it. So now these oranges all work together as one, but this guy's unique and he's different, right? And so they're kind of bouncing each other off out across the center of the frame too. And so some of the elements we can do is we can kind of start adding some other elements in here to give a sense of time or adding details that gives a sense of storytelling. We also have this relationship between them, right? We're kind of counterbalancing what's going on over here with this like little orange peel over here. So they're kind of following that rule of good figure or that law of good figure to kind of balance each other out. And then here's some other small tweaks they made. Like for instance, this shape was kind of flat and even right here. Like these two were mirroring each other, so they removed one of them, so it was a little bit more interesting, irregular shape. They twisted this because there's a better face on this one, and they're a little bit different here, so now that looks a little bit more interesting. Um, Changed a little bit of the shaping or the shape right here of this orange to complement the shape of the bowl a little bit. So they just moved that a little bit so it kind of complements the shape a little bit. And then they also added this little unique piece here just to add a little bit more interest. And again, overlapping with that bowl so it's not, so separate, but they're starting to like cluster and work together. Here's some rules that I've kind of come up with or found over the years personally is that for this project, you want to find, especially for your hero objects, background objects is not as important. You want to find the best angle for your hero objects. So some objects make your object more descriptive and dimensional, and this is usually how light and shadow work on the object. So in this case, with this accordion, if you put it on its side or like this or this, it's not the best angle in my opinion, right? It's like kind of confusing. It doesn't describe the object very well. But then you get this like 3/4 angle and you can see clear light side, shadow side, and you're getting a good sense of structure of the object. So for instance, here's another one, right? This crate in the background was really flat, and because it's looking straight on, you don't see the sides. But then just rotating it a little bit, you can kind of get a good idea of the structure of the whole asset. So that really helps with, I think, adding that dimensionality to your objects and composition. Don't be afraid to adjust shapes of your objects in the composition, right? So in this case, right, I have this rose I added in, but you can see I just used like a bend deformer and then tore off one of the petals just to kind of add a little bit of like that texture micro dressing to the scene, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Also pay attention to the focal length and camera placement because these are very important too. So the longer or higher your focal length is, the flatter your composition is, which isn't bad. It's usually more appealing, but your sense of perspective is flattened. And then over here, when you use a lower focal length or a wider lens, you have a much more drastic sense of perspective. And so you get this deep, deep image. So it can be a little too dynamic, but, use what your taste kind of gives you. But, your camera focal length and where your camera is, where it's positioned, is really, really important. Color is, we're going to talk about color and we'll go through a few more slides. Let's see how many. Ooh, couple. Okay, so let's. Okay, that's great. Slideshow. Cool. So when we talk about color, we talk about it in three different ways. We have our hue, which is the name of the color. So that's like what your red, green, cyan, blue, purple is. You have saturation, which is how intense the hue is relative to being like grayscale, right? Like, is it red or is it more gray, right? The more red it is means it has a deeper saturation. Value is how light or dark the color is in black and white terms, right? So how much black or white is in there, how bright or dark it is. Um, our hue, right, is on a color wheel or a color spectrum. So, or we usually represent it as a color wheel, but it's on a spectrum from, violet to RG, Roy G. Biv, red to violet. So colors associated with on this wheel that are associated with opposite complementary colors. So these usually work really well together. So for instance, red and green are high contrast. Those are complementary colors. Blue and orange look amazing together. Violet and orange and yellow, those also look great together, right? So you can usually look at the opposite sides of your color wheel to find complementary color schemes. Tinting and shading is just adding white or black. You guys don't have to worry about that right now. And so we're working with an additive color system. So this is where the color of our objects is essentially made by adding more light. So to get to white or get up to white, you add more color. You add more wavelengths of color. So this is essentially how TVs and screens work is, as you add more different color wavelengths, you start to get white, right? And then we have, if you're like painting or you're drawing or you're working with a physical medium that's not emitting light, but it's reflecting light, then you have a subtractive color system. So this is where as you add more colors, you tend to get closer to black, right? It doesn't get brighter, it tends to get darker. The reason being is, screens and, TVs and stuff like that, they create light, right? They're creating more light. Like each time you add a new wavelength, you're adding more light, right? Whereas with surfaces and non-light emitting surfaces, they absorb light. So by adding more colors in there, you're adding more surfaces that absorb light. And essentially, you're adding new wavelengths or color materials that are going to eat in the light. So that's going to be like your paints, your dyes, your inks. So you have your primary colors. So these are the basic essence. These colors cannot be mixed by two others. So that's going to be like your yellow, your blue, and your red. Green is technically in screens, it's usually red, green, blue that are like your primaries. They're not primaries from an art sense, they're primaries as in those are your base fundamental like color elements that you work with, but that's just for a different reason. That's not because that's for mixing purposes. You have your secondary colors, so these are the ones that are mixed by combining two of your primaries together. So, blue and red make purple, blue and yellow make green, yellow and red make orange. And then they're usually, complemented by colors on the other side. And then you have your tertiary colors, which are like a mixture between your primary and secondary. You have your complementary colors, so these are the colors that are located on opposite sides of the color wheel. So those are usually used very easily to essentially make like an interesting or well composed image in terms of color, right? Like those colors look nice near each other. You have to use them sparingly. You don't want to make everything complementary, but it is used to make like a pairing or adding accent, right? If your image is mostly blue or mostly orange and red, adding a little bit of blue can be like a really nice finishing touch or a really nice accent that you can add to the image. Analogous colors would be colors that are all near each other in the color wheel. So these have little contrast and they work together and they blend really well together. So obviously with interior design and room design, I don't know what happened to that image. Those all tend to be probably analogous, right? A monochromatic would be everything's the same color, right? But analogous is everything's very close to each other in the color wheel, right? So it's very comfortable. We also have active and passive colors, so colors that are on the warm scale. Those are areas what we associate with warmth. So we all have this like kind of connotation of red being very warm and blue being very cool. So your warm colors tend to be very active and they come forward, and cool colors tend to fall back. So you can use this to like control depth in the image, right? So in this case from Van Gogh, right, you have these warmer colors in the foreground and cooler colors in the background. Um, Colors can either harmonize or contrast with each other. So analogous colors harmonize and draw very little attention. So you can see these two colors next to each other. They don't draw a whole lot of attention. They work really well together. Complementary colors contrast very, very strongly, right? So you can see it's like, this red versus this green next to each other. They like fight and vibrate. And then also warm and cool colors tend to contrast pretty well against each other. So again, higher contrast makes more focus and more visual interest. So here's some examples, right? All these greens, browns, yellows, oranges, right? They're all so close to each other on the color wheel, but then you have these distinct blues, right? Like this blue just pops, right? Like this blue and red, high contrast. This red and blue, high contrast, right? Even this red and blue is pretty high contrast. I don't know why it's there. But you know, all these characters, they're so similar on the color wheel, they don't draw a whole lot of attention to each other. So that's it. Hope this helps. I know that was a lot, but these are all things that hopefully you guys can draw from and think about when you're arranging your image and thinking about what you want the viewer to look at and how do all the elements in your image work together to make a more pleasing composition.